everyone, welcome and thank you for coming back to Listening In, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society podcast. In this series, we want to give you the opportunity to listen in to some of the conversations that we are lucky enough to have every day. That is, with a variety of people and organisations all working in the field of mental health and well-being. Please be aware, this episode explores the topic of childhood abuse. At a time when the media landscape once more forces us to confront the awful reality of childhood abuse, we are blessed today to be joined by Olivia Peri, Head of Learning with NAPAC, that's the National Association of People Abused in Childhood. Olivia and I look at what happens for victim survivors when high-profile people and high-profile cases dominate the national conversation. What impact does it have on them, on their loved ones, and on those who support them? And what happens when those accused do not appear to be held to account? Olivia has the ability to speak about this sensitive and complex subject with a balance of compassion and sound clinical practice. Her empathy is the compass by which she navigates her way to finding appropriate, compassionate, supportive ways to sit with victim survivors. And I think this very much comes across in our conversation. She says there's around 13.6 million disclosed survivors in England and Wales, which means that 1 in 3 people will have been impacted by non-recent abuse before the age of 18. But in 2026, when we've sent people round the furthest orbit past the moon, we still find it difficult to sit with the idea that things can happen to people in those ways, and that people, when they make a disclosure, have done so. She goes on, belief is probably one of the most important currencies that we can give somebody with points of disclosure. I hope you enjoy listening in and you take as much away from Olivia's wisdom as I did. I know when we first sort of started working out how this conversation was going to unfold, and I suppose do justice to such a broad and wide and complex and difficult subject, sensitive subject. We sort of thought that perhaps because it is so topical right now, we have things like the Epstein files that are very high up in the public awareness. And we all know of those historic cases that have come out over the last sort of decade or so, that might be a really good sort of peg to hang our conversation out and on, and then sort of from there start to explore the subject and the role NAPAC plays within that. So just to give people a sense of who you are before we start, and who NAPAC is for those that don't know, would you mind just sort of giving us an introduction in that sense to who you are and what you do, I suppose, right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'll start with NAPAC first because it feels like the most important introduction in the room. So NAPAC is the National Association for People Abused in Childhood. We are the only free national support service, and we support any adult survivor, so anyone over the age of 18 who has experienced any non-recent abuse under the age of 18. So we support adult survivors for a number of reasons. We have a safeguarding remit that would look different if we supported young people. What young people need therapeutically or emotionally is often in addition to something only as an email or telephonic service. And at NAPAC, we have 2 primary support offerings. So we turn 27 next month, which is really wonderful. And we support people via our free, confidential, anonymous telephonic service, so people can phone us Monday through to Friday, 10 a.m. until 9 p.m. And on Friday, we close a little bit earlier. We close at 6. And it is a totally anonymous service. It runs nationally. You don't have to give us any identifying information. Now, what I think is useful for listeners to know, it is not a therapy offer, because we probably have around 10,000 contacts with victims and survivors a year. We could not offer that kind of therapeutic input at scale, and you also don't get the same human being every time you phone. So every conversation is a new opportunity to speak about what's live for you. There are two things to bear in mind. Number one, we have no abuse hierarchy at NAPAC. So whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, financial, etc., all abuse types matter. They very rarely happen in isolation. And for those who don't feel equipped, ready, or maybe are a little bit nervous about that telephonic step, we have an email support function as well. So that is running around the same time. We try and answer every email within a 1 to 2 day period. And every email, and I think this is crucial, especially in the day and time that we are now, is answered by a person. So we don't have an AI function. We believe a person needs a person. So that's NAPAC. Faye, does that feel clear?
It feels very clear, beautifully put. Really important, I think, when you mentioned that there's no hierarchy in the types of abuse that people come to talk to you about, and added to that sense of that very rarely does one happen in isolation. I think that's such an important point to make, because I think sometimes we can fall into that sense of it's this type of abuse or it's that type of abuse, and label it and focus on it without stepping back and seeing it through a wider lens. What else, what layers are part of that, and other types of abuse are happening. So even just in that sense, it's really helpful for you to describe it in that way. And lovely, and so important that there's, like you say, no AI bots, no automated responses in that sense, going back to people at their first point of contact, because we all know the steps somebody's taken to make that first call or to sit and write that first email. The very least they deserve, is to have another human being read or hear that and respond to that. It's essential, isn't it? To me, it's a basic, and I know it's not the way the world is going, sadly. But all we can do as organisations like our own and like yours just continue to do what we can do to keep that human relationship going.
Yeah, be front and centre. And I think you'll hear me use the word victim or survivor interchangeably in this conversation. I know for some listeners you may use client or service user, person, human. We support disclosed survivors. So those are individuals with that direct lived experience who actively have identified themselves personally or professionally. We have our undisclosed survivors, and these are humans who have never told anyone in their personal or professional orbit. And our data, as it stands, says that it can take somebody on average 22 years to disclose for the very first time. So that disclosure point it carries so much weight and importance. And especially as we talk about media a little bit later, the reasons why people reach that point of disclosure comes at different places for different people. And I think it's worth me saying here as well that a disclosed survivor could be undisclosed about other things. So if you're in a therapy space or that counseling relationship with someone, or even supporting somebody personally, you may know only what they've told you. People may hold those undisclosed elements. So I design, and NAPAC design, every contact as though there are undisclosed survivors in every room.
So that's the position you start from, the position you hold. What do I not know about this person? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Don't make assumptions. I think that's crucial.
Yeah. Those hurt and vulnerable parts of ourselves take time, don't they, to be able to show, to feel that sense of exposure, I feel, and we'll give a little bit of that and may never. And I think it's a really important part in terms of what you do at NAPAC, at what some of our listeners here may do in a therapeutic context. And that is, we need to understand that we may not always see or hear that person's whole lived experience. And that's absolutely their right, isn't it, to keep some of those most painful parts close to themselves. I understand that fully. So just one very brief practical question on the back of what you said you do at NAPAC. So we've talked about victims, survivors, disclosed, non-disclosed stories that they have. What about families, friends of? So is contact also made by people who are concerned about somebody else or on behalf of somebody else?
Yeah, so we have disclosed and undisclosed survivors that our service is so well equipped for, and it's that emotional processing piece that we have. We also support supporters of survivors. We know that supporting somebody, again, professionally or personally, carries weight. It carries sometimes even competing priorities. We found in family ecosystems, when somebody discloses, some of the family structures might want justice, might be really angry. The survivor might just want everything to go away. So when you have those competing points of priority, everybody in that ecosystem needs a place to go, because you'll have your own guilt, fear, blame. How could I not see this? What do I do? We find points of disclosure get a little bit younger, especially as people enter into those more intimate relationships, because those triggers might be a little bit more salient. So we support those personal relationships, partners, parents, friends, but also professional. So we've had police officers, counselors, psychologists, etc., make contact as well, because there's an incredible privilege at being a person disclosed to, but with that privilege also comes responsibility as well as your own points of understanding. So my too long don't read, Faye, is yes, we support the supporters as well.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And is it people just sometimes asking, how can I support? What do I do? That fear, that anxiety, that desire to get it right, and wanting to know what do I do with this? We hear it a lot, don't we, with grief and loss and bereavement. People don't know what to say, don't know what to do, and I imagine this is similar, perhaps even more so.
Yeah, I think what you say about the similarities towards grief and bereavement, we as people don't have an inbuilt metabolism to process horror at scale and to know what to do with it. And so much of our functionality comes at wanting to solve. And with trauma of this kind, especially non-recent, solving isn't always the most immediate need in the room. I think what I have seen, particularly with partners, is wanting to know how to not make it worse or trigger or re-traumatize, which tells me our human need is just to make things better, but not knowing that sometimes just active listening and saying, this changes nothing for me, you are still loved as you are, is one of the most powerful tonics we can offer somebody, non-judgmental, right? It's all the core ingredients. But I think at the point of disclosure, we can sometimes be so stunned, and it could even be sometimes quite unexpected. We just want to know what I can do to love this person well, support them better, help them.
It's those ramifications, those ripples, isn't it? We're seeing perhaps in our work, you're having one conversation on the phone. Clinicians are sat there with one person in the room, but actually there's this whole host of unseen people around them that are also impacted by the disclosure or by what's happened too. And somehow, somewhere, they're being impacted in the work that we are doing, aren't they?
Yeah.
Do you mind if we just take a little sidestep? So we've talked about, and obviously we'll come on to talk a lot more about what NAPAC do to help and support, and there's training and resources and all manner of things that are available. But how did you find yourself at NAPAC, if that's okay to ask? So for the people that don't know, you're a clinical psychologist, am I right? That's your training. So is there any particular thing that brought you into this world? Is it something you specialise in?
That's a great question. So for anyone playing Guess the Accent as you listen, you will probably know that, or maybe not, that I'm South African by birth. So I trained as a clinical psychologist in South Africa. I'm registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. It's different regulatory bodies than the UK. So I did a lot of clinical work, and I was a psychologist for the police as well in SA. When I emigrated, and that was 5 years ago now, which is so shocking and surprising to me.
So just after COVID?
Yeah, during COVID.
During,
November 2020.
Okay. Gosh.
Yeah, it'll be 6 years this year. So I found that private practice felt a little bit lonely. I didn't see as much opportunity to grow those networks for lots and lots of different reasons. And the charity sector in this country is very well established. So when we think about help at scale, I feel that charity and social enterprise is one of those powerful tools. So I found NAPAC on a job-seeking website. I read through the mission statements, etc., and I head up our training function. So I do all of the beautiful insights that we have gathered over these 3 decades and create that to train police officers, counsellors, psychologists, barristers, etc. So I act as the head of learning now. And just the reason why is because we have this support service and this operational arm that works so beautifully together. It was a very easy yes from me. And NAPAC have some really meaningful relationships across justice, policing, etc. Our CEO, Gabriel Shaw, is part of our victim and survivor engagement thematic work. So I think we're very well placed in the ecosystem of supporting survivors well.
And so well trusted within that, like you say, it's 27 years old, and I think such a well-respected, such a well-trusted organisation that I think it brings people to you, and then they get to meet brilliant people like you and Barbara and Kim and, those people that I know I've come into contact with at NAPAC, and then all that does is, just bolster that confidence in the support or the training that you offer. Yeah, what a lovely happenstance that you come here and then end up somewhere like that. And I can really, part of my role here at the Society and part of the reason why, it's myself that you will often come into contact with from NAPAC is my role with our organisations more generally, most of which are charities, social enterprises, etc. And it's one of my, happy places at work is meeting those organisations, those services, the people within them, and just the dedication, the commitment that they do, sometimes, against all the odds in terms of funding and resources, but just a group of committed people working to support people within a certain demographic. It's quite something to be part of. And I'm just here on the outside observing and witnessing, I'm not actually in there doing it. But so a big thank you, I suppose, to you and all the team. So if we come back then, Olivia, to that, what you do, which again, I know is a very broad and big question. Is now the point perhaps to move into the sort of the topical, the current landscape that we find ourselves in terms of the narrative that's occurring around abuse, childhood abuse in particular. And as I mentioned at the top, we've got, I suppose, mostly we've got the Epstein files, and for those in the UK, then I suppose that taps into other prominent figures. We've got Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, we've got everything going on with Mandelson and all of this stuff going on. Obviously, our place isn't at the moment to look into what's actually happened there. But it always strikes me that these things come out and we, perhaps the public make an assumption that it can only be a positive that these things are being talked about in the open. And they're rising to the surface, and it's shining a light on what, I'm going to say, people in power. I only say that because that's where our focus is at the moment. Of course, that's not always necessarily the case, although the power dynamic is another part of all this altogether. But what about for people, for victim survivors that have experienced this themselves in their own lives, and they are bombarded every day when they switch on the news, when they go online, when they're on their phones, that it's coming up. Even in, you can block all the news sites, can't you? But you just go on social media and something will come up about it, somebody's commentary, somebody's own experience. What is it that, so it's a very long question, what is it that NAPAC is hearing and experiencing as a result of these media stories that come into public consciousness?
I will answer this in a number of parts. So I think it's important to preface this that when I bring victim and survivor experience into this conversation, I will never do the full scale of experience justice in the time we have available. We could have a podcast for 17 working days. Now, media boom and bust cycles have actually got a very special and significant story for NAPAC's history. One of our most significant spikes in callers. So we don't do any outbounding, and that's because victims or survivors may still live with their perpetrators, for example. People have to phone us. That shows us the point of willingness. We had a significant spike in the very early 2000s after the Jimmy Savile documentary. Mm-hmm. When you have a media story, it depends on the landscape it comes in. And with Jimmy Savile, it was very shocking. There was a big breach of collective trust. And we saw a spike in survivors saying, this is in the media landscape. I can now talk about it too. So it opens consciousness and that public awareness. The challenge with that is how people, whether they're alleged perpetrators or not, or how the abuse and those harms are framed, can really impact how people carry that weight. So if I zoom forward into the Epstein file specifically, injustice is a huge wound, not just in non-recent abuse, but across that trauma profile. And how slow the wheels of justice appear to turn is very eroding. And we see survivors come in with the sense of almost this ambient trauma exposure wound, because you're right, it's on your phone, it's on your laptop. If you walk into any agency, a news article might be flying around on a TV program, for example. So survivors arrive with the exposure being quite difficult to control, with the media landscape sometimes not really focusing on the justice, but using words like victims and their abusers, almost like there's these pronouns of ownership. And because of how media get their traffic, especially in the online spaces, the words are very inflammatory. And it can sometimes feed into this idea of victim blaming, victims jumping on the bandwagon. And you can't see me, but I'm holding up quotation marks above my head. So the framing around how it reads public narrative is very important. The justice arc and the wheel turns incredibly slowly. And when injustice is a core wound, it can actually impact how victims or survivors feel equipped to disclose this to statutory agencies. Because if somebody like Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and that sort of call to account, or any of the other alleged perpetrators in some of the other media pieces that are live at the moment, when we don't see justice being taken place, how do I have confidence and public trust that police agencies or other statutory agencies will look after me, take my story seriously, and not paint me with the same brush as some victims or survivors get painted in that landscape? And we also know, to conclude my very long/short answer, there are victims or survivors who have had and experienced incredible harm as a result of that public disclosure piece as well. So that is me giving you a wrap of some of the costs of that disclosure. I hope that answers the beginnings of your question at the very least.
I'm crossing up when I'm trying to remember something, because I'm very old now and my memory fails me. I cross my fingers. And I haven't got enough fingers to cross from certain things that you mentioned there. I think one of those crossed fingers is about that. What a wonderful phrase you used. Ambient trauma exposure wound, you said. And that really struck me, just that word ambient in that, just all pervading, just sat there everywhere around, like whispers, isn't it? Like just background noise. Also, what really struck me, and actually, maybe this is my own naivety and my own gap in knowledge, but was when you mentioned about victims and their abusers creating that connection, almost a relationship there that they are trying desperately to get away from and to tether. I'd never thought of it in that way, Olivia. That's such a, and it's such a common phrase that we use. And I suppose equally thinking about it the other way around too, abusers and their victims. That really, I'm not sure I've even got anything to say about that, except to say that really stood out to me when you were describing that.
Yeah, I think so. If I think about a piece of work we're doing now around trauma-informed communication, how media agencies can carry the privilege of disclosure better and differently. If I think about a piece I saw maybe 2 months ago that really stayed with me, Giselle Pellicot, who waived her anonymity in France and has led to one of the biggest rape and sexual assault trials in French history. She gave a powerful quote, one of many. I think that this is somebody who carries that privilege of disclosure so beautifully, even in her pain. She gave a quote, and the alleged perpetrator, her ex or current husband, was posted as the photo. So we have Giselle's words over somebody else's face. So even in how we look at those pieces, the imagery and the words that are used are very spiky. And we use words of ownership like their victim, their abuser, creating this exact relationship that we're trying to move away from and recover from. And ambient strikes me always because that's how that relationship to perpetrators can feel, especially if there's coercive control. This idea that it could pop up at any time and I can't really guard against it. And victims and survivors then have to do things like clear their cache, monitor their algorithms on social media. I think all of these things come into the fore in such significant ways. It adds that additional duty of care to try and keep yourself safe online. Mm-hmm. And the final thing I'll give you is, and this is not me laying blame at anyone's door, I think we as a society have inherited very spiky language, is victim blaming. Yeah. Where I have this idea that victims or survivors have a lot of misery branding attached. But when we victim blame, say people are jumping on the bandwagon, why are you disclosing now? And then we services shame. What were the police doing? What were these agencies doing? The narrative around what the perpetrator did or where the harm was, totally absolved. And that again feeds into this dialect of shame, blame, guilt, which is already so freely up for grabs, with surviving any type of non-recent abuse, recent abuse or trauma.
It's just so unbelievably complex, and you're right. The media, it always strikes me as well. Just headlines that focus on the victim, survivor, and what happened to them, rather than the perpetrator and what they've done. I hope that's starting to become something. I know there are quite a few social media accounts that focus on that and pull up, news headlines and rewrite them to say exactly the same thing, but in a much more appropriate way. And it's something, that all we can do is encourage everybody to listen and be mindful of that language and what that language, the impact that language can have for those that are actually at the heart of this, and that's the victim survivors themselves. You talked about victim blaming, victim shaming. What about disbelief, which I know you've briefly touched on it, I think, but that side of it too, whether that's the fear of being disbelieved, preventing somebody from disclosing, or perhaps stories you hear about disclosure and then people not being believed. Is there any more that you can help us understand about that, Olivia?
Belief is probably one of the most important currencies that we can give somebody with points of disclosure. I think that the fear of not being believed can feed into this idea of, did it really happen and was it my fault? And when we look at media communications around perpetrators, non-recent abuse and trauma, it feeds into a collective version of belief. Now, I have a complicated relationship with belief because I know that disbelief can be a defense mechanism of not my child or not in my own backyard.
Yeah.
This idea of, if we can create a perpetrator archetype to be a horrible human being that lives on a hut in a hill, we can create that psychological distance. And if I can think of the fact that victims or survivors we might meet every now and again, but not really, it creates the sense of distance. Now, statistically, what we know in the UK, I know the Office of National Statistics looked at some survey research, that there's around 13.6 million disclosed survivors in England and in Wales, which means that 1 in 3 people will have been impacted by non-recent abuse before the age of 18. So we know it's happening. But in 2026, when we have sent people down the furthest orbit past the moon, we still find it difficult to sit in the idea that things can happen to people in those ways, and that people, when they make a disclosure, have done so sometimes at cost to themselves. So what the media landscape does in terms of belief is the reactions to disclosures, the idea of me saying, but this was a really nice person, therefore could they really have done that? And the onus of responsibility to prove what happened often lies at the survivor's door. And that can mean, for me to access belief, I need to do one of two things. Either I need to go into incredibly graphic detail, and you might actually see this if any listeners are in a therapeutic relationship or have clients in the therapy space, where I need to use graphic detail as currency to be believed, or it feels like such a long shot because nothing is happening to these big powers that be, as you referenced earlier, Faye, that there's no value in me bringing it in the first place. And that's why the age of disclosure, or the time of disclosure, can be up to 2 decades long.
And then again, for some people, that brings with it, again, you alluded to this earlier, that sense of, well, why now? Why do it now? I've heard people in my life, often older people, not that that's making any excuse, but I think that's probably not unusual. Why did it take them this long? Why wait until the abuser has, or the alleged abuser has died, and then come out when they can't? And of course, we understand why that is, but it can be so difficult for people. And my anecdotal experience of that, lived experience of these conversations in a personal, private, not professional context, is of that almost adding, that length of time almost adding to the disbelief. And that just seems like, it's just awful, isn't it? It's just appalling that somebody's been holding this for so such a long time, and they come to that place where they finally feel that perhaps they can say it. And people say, well, even just because of the length of time, that makes me come at you from a place of cynicism and doubt.
Yeah, and distrust. I think the thing around belief and time, especially for things that have happened many years ago, and I think I'm preaching to the converted when I give this, but children don't have language for terrible things that happen to them. So we need that time to build that language piece. And I also know from NAPAC's research specifically, where there are undisclosed survivors, in some cases people don't know that they are a victim of trauma, harm, and abuse, especially in coercive control, those narcissistic relationship archetypes, financial exploitation. If we're looking at systemic traumas where it's handed down generation to generation, you don't know any better. Now, this is a very crude example, but I only knew that people could eat Weetabix if you added hot water and hot milk. And when I had my very first sleepover and I watched a friend just dump cold milk onto a Weetabix brick, I could have phoned my family in outrage and demanded to be collected immediately. When you don't have any other evidence for how Weetabix needs to be eaten, you just take it at face value. And when I saw somebody put it between, a piece of cheese and jam between two Weetabix bricks, I could have phoned the police. I was so outraged. Now, I don't mean to use levity unnecessarily, but when you don't know that things could happen differently, you don't have that you need to meet people and grow to understand what happened to you differently. I think that people build that relationship. They maybe end that relationship with the perpetrator, because if they're living with somebody who is accessing harm, because justice takes a while to really set in, there's a real danger to disclosure. And I think when somebody passes away, or when a lot of people come forward, it's not about jumping on the bandwagon. It's about the fact that I can add my story to a collective narrative and strengthen that story. We saw that in 2017 with the hashtag #MeToo movement.
Yeah.
80 people came forward against or within that Weinstein case because other people just hashtagged and said Me Too.
Yeah.
There is so much safety in that collective narrative, and there are risks in disclosing publicly, but there are also incredible benefits, as we've seen with Giselle Pellico, Tarana Burke in 2006. If I think about any of the incredible human beings in the Epstein files, which is still very much live and topical at the moment, when we have people in the media landscape that helps us connect to say, me too, we actually see a positive trend in terms of disclosure, because people do react to victim blaming, but we also react to bravery.
Yeah.
And bravery can be the exact tonic that we need, especially when our phones feel so spiky, nefarious, and quite hopeless.
The Me Too type, when did you say that was?
2017.
2017, gosh. That's extraordinary, isn't it, to think it was that long ago? For me, it felt like and I still look back at that as a massive learning curve, actually, for me in my own practice, because it was this time whereby female clients that I was working with, and I say female because that is what my experience was, I should say, female clients who had been seeing me for all manner of different, presenting with all manner of different issues and challenges and coming into therapy for different reasons. There was this time, this period of it was probably a few months, whereby they would come into the room and they would just sit and say, I want to talk to you about my Me Too moment. And I just remember it just became this thing. It just became this pattern. It just took over my therapy room completely for that period of time. I am seeing it again now to a certain degree. My practice is so much smaller now, so by definition, it's going to be less. But since the Epstein files, it's brought some level of that back in. But I do look back at that time whereby it seemed all of a sudden people were saying, actually, I feel okay. And they didn't necessarily want to do anything with that disclosure. It was me too. I just want you to know that actually I've had my experience like that. It was quite an extraordinary time. Bearing in mind, I've been in practice for about 20 odd years at that point, and I don't remember a time quite like it where it seemed like everybody was just wanting to bring a similar theme into the work, into the room. So that, I hope I just tell that, I know slightly personal story, but just from the position of what you were saying, how it can embolden, how that bravery can be, something really positive, and people feel ready to make their own disclosure in their own way with the people they feel they want to make it to. And I suppose, Olivia, that moves us on to another point that we both felt would be helpful to discuss in this conversation today. And that is about, how do these things show up in the therapy room? Which again, I mean, how long have we got left? 10, 15 minutes or so. But how do these things, because the work NAPAC does, as you were so clear, is not necessarily counselling or therapy per se. So there's that role that you are playing, that vital role with people calling in. What about in a clinical context? What can that look like, and what might be helpful for practitioners to know?
I think that the long arc of media injustice gets processed in the therapy room. In my experience, there is oftentimes a delay, even with NAPAC support provision. We see that people will phone us a couple of days, weeks, and even months after Mother's Day, for example, with that collective sort of relational mother wound. With the media, we see almost an immediate reaction, but we see a long-term response days, weeks, and months after. So what I would think about in your therapeutic practice is when somebody, and Faye, you've already mentioned this, shows up with something that feels quite incongruent with what they're presenting. Could be familial challenges, self-esteem at work, and you can feel it shift. When that relational space feels different. So when things happen that are incongruent or confusing but weighty, I normally find collective grief carries so much weight. It could be that somebody's processing that media arc. What I find clinically happens as well is because, again, in the sort of news cycles, there's a lot of horror up for grabs. It impacts our ability to feel compassion and curiosity. So people become very apathetic, very cynical. This idea of not even #MeToo, but it becomes #of course. We lose the capacity to feel surprise. And we get how you'll see it in people's relationships around them, especially if they kind of trend neutral to positive, is very grumpy, very frustrated, very much like this is adding again. So I find people are quite full and they spill, or they're totally depleted and don't feel that joy. Start deprioritizing or canceling therapy a lot. I find that happens as well. And my final little nugget is being very hypersensitive to what you write down in your notes. What are you writing? What did you take from this? So especially if somebody's quite new to that space or presenting with a lot of complex need, well, you'll find that they'll be testing you to make sure that you're still a trustworthy object, because I have so much global evidence that everyone is out to get me. So if you have somebody with that hypervigilance behavior, that might be a little bit heightened as well. I've given you a lot, Faye, so I'll pause there for breath.
It's perfect. It's wonderful and eloquent as ever. And I find myself wanting to ask a question in response that I hope is appropriate to ask. My fear is that people will feel that this question is denigrating practitioners that are out there, and that's not why I'm asking at all. We all understand, we all have supervision, we all understand reflective practice and that need to look at what could I have done differently, what could I have done better, or what perhaps do I wish I hadn't have done. So I'm coming from that space rather than coming from the space of saying, oh, people don't know what they're doing, because of course that's not the case. The question is, do you hear, do you understand anything in your conversations at NAPAC from victim survivors of experiences they may have had, and perhaps it's just gone a little bit wonky? That I suppose I'm asking, what are common mistakes that can be made when working with a victim survivor?
What we hear is trust ruptures happen. And when somebody brings a disclosure that a counsellor or a therapist isn't expecting, especially if reactivity is quite high in the world, people react very quickly and climb into safeguarding first before listening from a place of curiosity. And I find with victims or survivors, when you have a very high mental load and somebody immediately climbs into problem solving, it just gives me more things to do, more signposting. Now I have to phone NAPAC, now I have to phone the Samaritans, or whatever your signposting offering is. With a pause to just listen and create that breathing space for both people to acclimate to this thing around them, it is very necessary. And in some cases, we've had therapists either cut the person off or not bring it up again, and it becomes a little bit of an unspoken elephant in the room. Now, I say this with the knowledge that when we know better, we do better. And I'm sure, Faye, you can agree with me. In my own clinical work, I know that I could have done things better for people that I was in therapeutic relationships with. So I would say, to summarize, is to not climb into active listening. Victims and survivors can see if people are already building a risk assessment plan at the back, because you get that almost glazed look in you know what I mean, or sort of multitasking. And I did in a virtual, this is probably quite niche, in a virtual therapy, a therapist, I think, had their WhatsApp open and the survivor could hear the pings in the background of the sort of notification sound. So it's just with the space you set up is very important, and how you close and manage an ending, even if there is a disclosure, and how you carry that conversation forward is very important, which is why contracting before contracting is necessary, is so crucial. That's why we do all of that at that beginning, because it sets the frame so that when a disclosure happens, A, it is so privileged and you are a trusted source of truth, and B, you then with that person have built this toolbox, even if it's a bit cumbersome, around what to do next.
That's so beautifully put. Thank you, and so right, and such a brilliant answer to the slightly clumsy question that I asked. Thank you, Olivia. It's listening to your response. There's two things that you made me think of. One is almost in movement, actually. So you've talked about, the safeguarding, the risk assessments, the planning that some people, the mode that some people may go into. And it just made me think of that sort of changing up a gear and leaning forward and what do we do about this? Yes, exactly. Sorry, I know people can't see, but Olivia and I are both acting out this, yeah. Whereas actually it's about space creating. It's about moving down a gear or two, isn't it? It's about sitting back, opening up that space. And I know it's what we all know on some level, sitting there in it with somebody and being alongside them without feeling the need in that moment to do. But sitting back and being there with them is doing, isn't it? It's absolutely doing. And it doesn't matter whether you're newly qualified, whether you're in placement or whether you are long in the tooth and been at it, we all can. You're so right. Particularly if as a practitioner, we might be a bit tired, or it's the last appointment of the day or something, and somebody brings this in that you're not expecting, and that tightening, that clenching, that rising of the shoulders, that's not necessarily happening literally, but again, if I were to act it out on a stage, that might be how we would be feeling. And it's just about bringing that down, isn't it? That's such a helpful response. The other thing that your answer made me think of, you mentioned this word much earlier when we were talking about friends and family members and their desire to help to make things okay. And you use the word responsibility around that. And I'm just thinking, as we start sort of to bring this conversation to a close, of that level of responsibility that sits on the shoulders of a victim survivor, whether we want them to have that or not, whether they want to have it or not. It's there by default, isn't it? We feel we want to take part of that load from them, but actually that's never going to be completely part. There's always going to be a level of responsibility for them, isn't there? On so many levels of this pathway that they're taking from the moment of disclosure. Is that a fair thing to say?
Totally. People are already carrying that load. The difference here is they're showing you what they're carrying. And, as we bring the conversation to a close, we're a negative nervous system to begin with. So we want to front load. If we're leading by the fear of getting it wrong rather than the value of getting it right, we say things like, I'm not saying I don't believe you, or I'm so sorry you went through that. Very kind of negative to neutral. There is so much value in saying, I believe you. That is such a tonic, and saying things like, thank you for telling me that, really making it known that it's a privilege. And the thing maybe I'll think about as we come to our ending is, I have never had an empathic conversation and somebody starts it with at least. At least you're over it. At least it's the weekend. At least needs to die from our lexicon. So I'll be doing a petition after this, Faye. You can join me on social media.
I'll be the first signature.
Great. So at least there's just no value for those minimizing statements. We want to chop that up smaller for the victim or survivor. Nobody needs it to be chopped up smaller. They just need the recognition of how much they've been carrying and to carry it differently. That would be how I would probably bring this to a close, is just highlight the privilege and kill at least.
Kill at least. What a brilliant, I'd never thought of it like that. And again, it makes me think of that whole bereavement and loss that, people, well, at least you had a lovely life with them, or, at least this, at least that. Oh, it's so, and it's just, it's meaningless at best, and at worst it's harmful and painful. So what a great place. Well, I say to end on, I do have one final question, if that's okay. We all know, well, those of us that work alongside people that are struggling, people that are feeling challenged, that work in itself can be challenging. And I just wanted to ask, whether it's about yourself or your friends and colleagues at NAPAC, what are your top 2 or 3 ways to bring yourself, regulate yourself back, whether that's during work, whether that's at the weekend in your own free time? What are your favourite things to do that give you back to yourself, if that makes sense?
Yeah. My favourite question. So in points of compassion fatigue, when I've had to care a lot and my empathy stores are depleted, I love intentional altruism, which is the selfish act of doing good for me. Now, that could either be going for a run, being in nature, it demands nothing, anything where I'm not managing the emotional state of somebody else, or, and maybe I need to change my name to Gary after saying this, watching reality television, because you can sit in a place of judgment and just kind of, you need to be careful with it, but it can be really useful. In vicarious trauma, so when I've had sight of somebody's horror and I feel a bit powerless to change it, and I've got a lot of detail maybe. Movement is amazing. So is texture. I have never been vicariously traumatized and been comforted by a soup. So I do crisps, sparkling water, things that are very texturally interesting, peppermints, sour sweets. Faye is saying me too. You need to find things that you can either chew, crunch. Marvelous Creation chocolate, and I'm not even sponsored to say this, has like 3 different textures. It's phenomenal. And in burnout, so when my body has carried the cost of caring, I access predictability, which is when I rewatch shows where I know the ending. So I don't have to feel that capacity for what happens next. Those would be my sort of 3 go-tos. You need good support networks, and my most valuable ones are ones where I can just scream into the void and they don't try and solve it, and they just say, you know what, that does sound hard. And I feel so much better when my pain is observed by another person.
Yeah, what a brilliant answer. The familiarity and reliability of a TV show or a film that you love. And I think you must be one of the few people I've ever met that can relate to that sort of sour, bitter, crunchy, salty sort of. I'm all over that, Olivia. I'm all over that. So thank you so much. What we will do is, as always, when we publish this recording, in the show notes, as they call them, which always sounds very grand, we'll put lots of links to NAPAC, to different resources for members of the society that have our Counselling Matters magazine. They will have seen a recent article written by Kim about gambling and gaming addiction, and also your brilliant presentation that you gave at our Brighton event sits on the member portal also. So there's lots of different things that we'll signpost people to that they can access and just learn more about the brilliant work that NAPAC does. So thank you so much for giving us your time today. It's just been brilliant to spend an hour with you, Olivia.
I could not agree more. I think the world is very lucky to have you in it. So Faye, as always, thank you for everything that you are and everything you do.
Thank you to Olivia for joining us today, and thank you for listening in. To find out more about the work of Olivia and the team at NAPAC, you can find the link in the notes below. This podcast is brought to you by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, a professional home for counsellors, psychotherapists, and over 120 wellbeing organisations across the UK. Autonomy, diversity, creativity and community are at the heart of what we do. We're creating a positive space for conversations with people who share common beliefs and goals, because together our voice is louder. If you would like to know more about the NCPS, please visit www.ncps.com for more information. And please remember to follow and subscribe to this podcast so you're always part of the conversation.